Across the landscape of modern fantasy stands no figure more tangled in narrative betrayal than Daenerys Targaryen. Silver-haired and dragon-born, she rises from a souled bride, adrift in the Dothraki Sea, to the breaker of chains and the hope of millions held in bondage. Years of suffering and hard-won victory weave the weight of Messianic Promise into every step of her journey. Simple death does not mark the end of her story. Systematic erasure strips her of complexity layer by layer until nothing remains but a one-note cautionary tale of female power and inherited madness. Claims of an inevitable descent into madness brush aside 7 full seasons of character growth and deliberate moral choice. Even years after the final frame fades to black, the turn from Liberator to Queen of Ashes carries a persistent sense of unearned brutality. Marketed as bold subversion of audience expectation, the choice reveals itself on closer inspection as a failure of narrative courage. Years of careful storytelling built a symbol of revolutionary hope, only to be torn down for the cheap thrill of momentary shock value. This autopsy traces the piece-by-piece dismantling of a character arc, and the permanent scar left on a franchise that sacrificed its most iconic figure for a single fleeting twist. Imagery of rebirth and redemptive fire stitches through the early chapters of Daenerys' arc. Into the pyre of Khal Drogo she steps, and from the flame she emerges unburnt, 3 newborn dragons clutched tight to her chest. The moment reads as a living miracle in a world that had long forgotten the touch of magic. No villainous framing clings to these beats of her story. Messianic weight shapes every shot, every line of dialogue, every triumphant beat of her journey east of the narrow sea. Burning shackles send plumes of smoke curling above the slave cities she walks through. Lifting the downtrodden becomes her quiet mission as she gives them names, voices, and the right to choose their own fates. To the people she frees, she becomes more than a queen. She becomes a figure of light cut into a landscape of unending cruelty. None of this framing unfolds by accident of fandom interpretation. Baked into the visual language of her Essos days is a deliberate promise of justice delivered. Her fire burns slaver ships, executioners, and men who built their fortunes on the buying and selling of human flesh. Wielded with clear purpose, it targets only the architects of oppression. Season after season, this promise anchors her identity as something entirely new to the brutal feudal order of Westeros. No ordinary claimant to a throne fights for the end of the system that produces thrones and slaves alike. Radical vision sets her apart from every lord and knight who plays the game for personal gain. Brutal speed unravels all of this careful work in the final stretch of the story. A woman who once weighed every act of violence against the cost to innocent life turns to burning an entire city full of civilians after its formal surrender. No steady bridge of character development connects the breaker of chains to the Queen of Ashes. Established flaws and slow-burning trauma do not feed the turn. A sudden lurch of plot delivers the shift, mandated by the need to reach a predetermined ending at the cost of all prior characterization. Rejection of this choice among viewers stems not from a desire for simple, happy endings. It grows from the sense of a broken contract between story and audience, forged over years of emotional investment. The promise made in Essos was never kept. It was discarded, tossed aside for the cheap shock of watching a beloved hero curdle into a monster. What set Daenerys apart from every other claimant to the Iron Throne was her rejection of the game itself. Built not solely on birthright or the glory of conquest, her political philosophy rested on the promise to break the wheel. She spoke of a world where birth did not seal fate, where the strong could not prey on the weak with impunity, where the endless cycle of usurpation and war might finally reach its end. Radical by every standard of Westerosi feudalism, this vision had no precedent in the recorded history of the Seven Kingdoms. No prior ruler had ever proposed dismantling the very system that granted them power. Tangible form came to this vision through her actions in Slaver's Bay. Conquest alone did not define her time in Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. Centuries-old chattel slavery met its end under her rule. New courts and new laws took root in the wake of the old order. Relentless insurgency and political sabotage did not stop her from trying to build a government inclusive of both former slaves and former masters. Perfection never marked her rule there. Brutal mistakes stained her record. Compromise replaced open conflict more than once against her own fiercer instincts. Liberation proved easier to win than to govern, and she learned that truth at a heavy cost. All of these struggles added depth to her character, not evidence of inherent madness. Targeted at the defenders of a dehumanizing system, her acts of violence carried deliberate framing as righteous. Slave masters and their armies burned beneath her dragons. The worst of her enemies met their end as food for her beasts. Harsh as they were, these steps appeared necessary on the path toward a more just world. Later narrative pivots reframed all of it as proof of a hidden dark streak waiting to consume her entirely. Moral context vanished from every choice she had ever made. Restraint shown towards suffering civilians faded from the official record. A complex revolutionary philosophy shrank into the simple rages of a woman born broken. Lazy narrative purpose drove this erasure of her political identity. A story of inherited insanity requires far less nuance than an exploration of a revolutionary figure. Turning her into a generic villain demands far less work than following her radical vision to its natural conclusion. Easier paths won out in the writing room. Everything that made Daenerys unique got stripped away. She became just another Targaryen tyrant, interchangeable with every mad king that had come before her. The most original and compelling political arc in the entire series got thrown aside for simplicity. The narrative device of the Targaryen coin flip became the primary tool for dismantling Daenerys' agency. Old folklore claimed that every Targaryen birth came with a toss of the gods, with greatness and madness hanging in equal balance. Introduced early as a piece of world-building superstition, the metaphor gradually elevated itself into a deterministic law of character. By the final seasons, it ceased to function as a cultural belief and became the official explanation for her descent. 7 seasons of character growth vanished in a single narrative stroke. A woman of agency, trauma, ambition, and empathy got reduced to a victim of her own biology. All her choices, all her struggles, all her moments of mercy and restraint meant nothing in the face of genetic destiny. Years spent learning to rule with wisdom counted for nothing. Repeated choices of negotiation over slaughter faded into irrelevance. Grief for every innocent life lost to her wars carried no weight against the predetermined verdict of her blood. She was always destined to burn. No action of hers could change the outcome. No lesson learned could save her from herself. Direct contradiction stands between this reading and the established facts of her journey. Remarkable strategic restraint defined most of her time in Essos and Westeros. Easy opportunities to sack cities got passed over again and again. Counsel from her advisors received careful consideration, even when it ran against her worst impulses. Her own claim got set aside to fight for the living against the army of the dead. None of these choices align with the behavior of a woman, ruled entirely by inherited madness. They belong to a complex person, capable of both great good and great cruelty, shaped by circumstance and conscious choice. Narrative convenience required the erasure of all prior context to sell her sudden shift to impulsive cruelty. Every lesson she ever learned had to be forgotten. Every moral boundary she ever set for herself had to be abandoned. A slow-burning story about trauma and power got turned into a cheap horror story about a crazy woman with dragons. The coin flip metaphor paid off no years-long setup. It served as a narrative shortcut. It justified a shocking ending without the work required to make it feel earned. Writers avoided the hard work of exploring the slow corrosion of power and blamed everything on bad blood instead. Desire for subversion, not character logic, drove the decision to turn Daenerys into a final villain. Shocking twists and the willingness to kill beloved characters had built the showrunners their reputation. Their final act needed to be the biggest shock of all. Every audience expectation about heroes and happy endings had to be overturned. In pursuit of that goal, they dismantled the most significant female icon in modern fantasy. Years of character work got sacrificed for a single moment of surprise. Tremendous cultural cost came with this choice. More than just a fictional character, Daenerys stood as a symbol of female liberation for millions of viewers. Abuse and exploitation marked her early life, and she rose to power on her own terms. That power got used to free the enslaved and challenge the systems that kept people pinned down. Immense resonance attached to her for many viewers, especially young women. Proof lived in her arc that a woman could be both compassionate and formidable, both gentle and ruthless, both a dreamer and a ruler. Cultural impact of that magnitude got erased by the ending. One final act of destruction came to define her entire legacy. The people she freed, the cities she rebuilt, the lives she saved, all faded into irrelevance. Her final mistake became the only thing anyone was allowed to remember about her. A story that once celebrated her as a breaker of chains ended by framing her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of giving women too much power. It fell into the oldest, most tired trope in all of storytelling. The powerful woman goes mad. The ambitious woman becomes a monster. The woman with fire in her veins must be put down by a good man with a knife. Hollow remains are all that is left of her story after this dismantling. No nuance survives the process. No room remains for the complicated truth of who she was. Only the simple, familiar narrative of hope curdling into horror is left. A symbol of revolutionary hope got repurposed into a generic warning about the corrupting nature of power. The twist is shocking, but it has nothing meaningful to say. No new insight into power or trauma or gender comes from it. It just takes a character the audience loved and breaks her, for no deeper reason than the ability to say, "No one saw it coming." Subversion, for the sake of subversion, is not bold storytelling. It is empty. A permanent scar was left on the cultural footprint of the entire franchise by the dismantling of Daenerys Targaryen. Game of Thrones had been the defining television event of its decade. Global conversation bent to its will, countless imitators followed in its wake, and a fan base of unprecedented scale invested deeply in its world and its characters. The final season and the treatment of Daenerys marked the end of that cultural dominance. Cooling enthusiasm for the franchise did not stem from a single bad episode alone. It grew from the sense that the story had betrayed its own core promise and discarded its most meaningful character for cheap shock. Mourning among viewers extended beyond the fate of a fictional queen. They grieved the loss of a rare kind of protagonist. Modern fantasy and drama still starve for female characters, allowed to be both complicated and victorious. Too many stories force women into narrow boxes. They can be good or evil, strong or soft, heroes or villains. Rarely are they allowed to be all of these things at once and still win. For a time, Daenerys seemed like she might break that pattern. She seemed like a character who could get her hands dirty, make hard choices, carry trauma and rage, and still build the better world she dreamed of. That possibility is what made her loss feel so profound. The final answer of the story is that women like her cannot be trusted with power. Their fire will always burn out of control. The revolutionary promise of a better world will always curdle into tyranny. This is not a bold or original message. It is the same message stories have told about powerful women for centuries. It is a safe, conservative take, wrapped in the clothing of shocking television. Reclaiming the character means acknowledging the failure of the writing, not the failure of the woman. The revolutionary fire of her early arc must be separated from the hollow ending forced upon her. Honor belongs to the parts of her story that still resonate, the parts that gave people hope. Systematic dismantling of her arc cannot erase the meaning she held for so many. It only exposes the limits of writers who could not imagine a better ending for a woman who wanted to change the world. Ashes of King's Landing cannot sum up the legacy of Daenerys Targaryen. Viewers who saw themselves in her journey from victim to liberator keep that legacy alive. The idea that the wheel can be broken endures, even if the story never had the courage to follow that idea to its end. Quiet truth lives on, that hope is not foolish, even when the stories we love betray it. The fire she carried was never just dragon fire. It was a promise of a world made kinder. That promise outlasts any bad ending. It outlasts any narrative betrayal. It burns still for everyone who ever looked at the silver-haired queen and dared to believe a better world was possible.